texture real good.
Hey y'all, welcome to Conversations in Black, the safe space for Black critical thought. Conversations in Black is a space facilitated by Musings from the Lighthouse that brings together Black artists and cultural custodians who demonstrate a commitment to the liberation of Black bodies. My name is Carla Felicia Scaife, and I am the founder of Musings from the Lighthouse. As conversation partners, we enter into an agreement in the space. In this space, we are intentional about the way we communicate thoughts and ideas. We intend for our language to be as accessible as possible by not allowing the specialized jargon of our respective disciplines to hinder clear communication. In other words, we want everyone to be able to understand what we're talking about. We demonstrate mutual respect for one another by being active listeners and offering thoughtful responses. We try our best to refrain from using ableist language, which includes words and ideas that are offensive to those living with physical or mental disabilities. We try our best to refrain from using language that isn't gender inclusive. For example, instead of saying all men are created equal, we might say that all people are created equal. And we affirm the right of anyone who participates to only discuss what they feel safe in offering to the conversation. We realize that we don't always get it right. And so we are also committed to being accountable for the ways in which we impact one another. Last week, we talked about the importance of self-definition. Today, we'll be thinking about boundaries and self-resourcing with Satoya Foster. Before we begin, let's center ourselves. So if you would, please take this time to be silent and take in a few deep breaths. As we continue breathing, let us remember our intentions, the worth of our bodies, and the power of our stories. Here today we have Satoya Foster. Hey girl, hey.
Hey.
Being here. You're so clutch. We know that this is your second time being here with us. Well, I know that it's your second time and some other people do. But if you would, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm terrible at telling people about myself, so that's one thing. I am an artist and writer and trauma recovery advocate. I am friends with Carla off of the interwebs, and so I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Yay! Okay. All right, let's start. So we have 5 questions to engage per usual. And if you have any thoughts, further questions, or if you need clarification on something, please feel free to leave a comment. As we affirmed last week and the weeks before that, your voice matters and we welcome the sound of it in this space. Okay, our questions are as follows. 1, what are boundaries and who are they for? 2, tell us about the difference between hard and soft boundaries. How does one determine which kind of boundary to set? 3, in the same way that we set boundaries for ourselves and expect for them to be honored, others do the same for themselves. Even when we have the best intentions, sometimes it's difficult to honor the boundaries of others in the way that we would like ours honored. Can you name some of the things that may contribute to this becoming difficult to do? what are some steps we can take to keep ourselves in check? Number 4, what is self-resourcing and how does it fit into this discussion? Number 5, in what other contexts is it useful to practice self-resourcing? Okay, so let's go back to the first one. Okay. What are boundaries and who are they for?
So I'm gonna talk about them separately. So boundaries are basically these invisible separations that we make between ourselves, for ourselves, between ourselves and others. And there are lots of different kinds of boundaries. There are physical boundaries, mental, emotional boundaries, sexual boundaries, material or financial boundaries, spiritual boundaries, and internal boundaries, which internal boundaries are like boundaries that we set for ourselves with ourselves. So like if we say that we're going to start going to bed at a certain time, that's a boundary we set for ourselves, like this internal kind of boundary. And boundaries are, this is something that I actually had to learn for myself in terms of who they're for. And so I remember I would get really upset when I felt like somebody crossed a boundary. And it's not that I don't have the right to be upset. It's more that when I set boundaries, I had to learn that they're for me, that they are things that I'm willing to do or things that I'm willing or not willing to engage with. And so it's not for the other person to be like, oh, that boundary is there or whatever. It's more that like, it's something that I enforce. It's my responsibility because I'm the one that set it. And it's obviously respectful for other people to respect boundaries when I exert them or when I talk about them, or if I say like, this is a boundary for me. Mm-hmm. And then it's up to me to enforce it if they cross that boundary. But boundaries are something that we set for ourselves.
Okay. That makes sense. But I'm curious, because you talked about the different kinds of boundaries. Can you give a couple examples of those different kinds of boundaries, like financial?
Yeah, so material or financial boundaries can look like what you're willing to give, what you're not willing to give, what you're willing to share, what you're not willing to share. And so an example of that would be like my daughter has her Big Bird and that is hers. Nobody else plays with her Big Bird. That is a boundary, a very clear boundary that she will let every and anybody know. No, that is my Big Bird. And then before you know it, somebody has problems. So for her, like a material boundary is Big Bird being hers and nobody else gets to play with it. She has other things that she'll share, which that kind of touches on like hard and soft boundaries, right? But that is an example of material boundaries, like a physical boundary, how close or how far you want people to be from you, or if you want people touching you or you don't want to be hugged or whatever. Mental and emotional boundaries, just kind of deciding how close or how far you are willing to let someone get to that aspect of yourself, what you're willing to engage emotionally and what you're not willing to engage. So those are some examples of the various kinds of boundaries.
So I have a question for clarification. As far as like what we're willing to engage and what we're not willing to engage, could an example of that be whether or not we click play on a video, like a video of somebody being killed, or like, you know, on Facebook or?
Yeah, that for sure. Like for me, that's a very clear mental boundary. And I feel like Facebook oversteps that when they do the automatic play thing. And maybe I'm just like not hip enough to know how to turn it off. But like I set a clear mental boundary where I don't want to see Black people being killed. And so I don't watch those videos because that is a mental boundary I set for myself.
So what does that look like interpersonally in terms of what you're willing or not willing to engage in emotionally?
Yeah, for me, interpersonally, that looks like having ownership over my own thoughts and feelings, and not being easily swayed by the thoughts and feelings that other people have. So
Mhm.
like making a very clear separation of what my beliefs are, what my feelings are, and what another person's thoughts and beliefs are. And my willingness to engage that is my willingness to engage that, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to merge with that person's thoughts or ideals.
Gotcha. Thank you. I didn't think of it like that. So that opens my eyes to something else. Okay, let's move on to the second question. Tell us about the difference between hard and soft boundaries, and how does one determine which kind of boundary to set?
Yeah, so the boundaries are interesting because boundaries are something that we learn.
Mhm.
They're not so. I've spoken about this before. I don't know if someone saw the last one that I was in, but I talked about having a background in developmental trauma, right? And so with having that background, there are certain things that I learned about boundaries. Um, I learned that through being physically abused, I learned that um, that physical boundaries didn't really matter. Like it did, like someone can harm me and there's nothing I could do about it. Like that's what I learned as a child, that like there was no protection. I couldn't say no or I couldn't say stop. Um, Likewise, people that have challenges with being codependent, they might feel like they don't have the right to tell another person that they have to handle something themselves or that they can't do something for them or whatever. So boundaries are learned in that regard. And then we grow up with a particular idea around what boundaries are based upon how we engaged boundaries in our developmental stage. And so in terms of how a person decides what kind of boundaries to set, that's a really tricky question because it's very individualized.
Mhm.
So like even you and I talked the other day about like how everyone has different boundaries around COVID and safety and so on and so forth. And like that is a very clear example where everyone doesn't have the same level of safety. Some people will go out to eat. Some people won't go out to eat. Some people might do takeaway food and some people might not even do that. Um, and so everyone really has to get to know themselves and get to know what their core values and beliefs are. So that way they can set proper boundaries for themselves. And with in respect to hard and soft boundaries, like there are some things that like are an absolute no. That's like a hard and fast boundary. And then there are other things that you might be more flexible with depending on the situation or depending on the person. Like I don't have the same boundaries with every single person. I don't have the same boundaries in every single situation, but there are certain boundaries for me that are always hard and fast. Like I don't loan money, like basically almost ever, unless I have it to give. Because for whatever reason, somebody might fall into a situation, they might want to borrow money and then find that they can't pay it back. And financial boundaries can ruin relationships. So like that's one of my hard and fast boundaries. But that might look different for other people depending on their circumstances and what they have, what they don't have, what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with. So it really depends on the person. And so I think that the more self-aware and the more self-observant people can be, and that kind of bumps up right against being self-resourcing, like kind of taking stock and asking yourself, what are my ideals? What are the things that I value? And then base your boundaries off of those things.
Okay. So I have a follow-up question. How, I guess in a nutshell, how best do you think we can go about becoming more self-aware so that we can assess what is best for us?
That's a really good question. I mean, there are lots of different ways to do that. I would say that that work is not easy at all, because it also involves being honest with ourselves. And a lot of people have challenges being honest with themselves. It takes time to learn, or how to practice noticing yourself and noticing how you feel about things, noticing what comes up for you in certain situations or certain conversations. And so like people really need to start engaging those things, becoming more self-observant, so that way they can become self-aware enough to determine what their boundaries should look like, but also be self-observant and self-aware enough to know when their boundaries may need to change, because we change, we evolve. Things that mean something to us eventually may mean something different to us. Relationships change, and so we might need to change the relationship, change the boundaries within a relationship, depending on what occurred in the relationship. So it takes a level of constant noticing, constant awareness for people to be able to determine boundaries.
So I'm going to ask you to say more about what you mean when you say what comes up, like what that actually like looks or feels like when we are doing that work of noticing.
Yeah, I use the phrase "what comes up" a lot, because I often stop and just kind of allow myself to connect with what I might be feeling, like what is happening in my internal world, right? So I wanted to share something about our senses. So we all learned that we have 5 senses, right? But there are 3 additional senses along with the 5 senses that actually make 8 senses. And the other 3 are vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoceptive. And interoceptive sensing is very interesting because it is how we experience our internal world. And so when I say I stop to think about what comes up for me, I'm basically saying that I'm stopping to observe my internal world, my internal environment, and what's happening. And then from there, I try to create enough space, enough of a pause to be able to respond and decide or determine what my boundaries may look like for a particular situation, or how I might want to enforce a boundary after I have checked in with myself. So really it's a checking in with ourselves.
So the internal world, that encompasses like what's going on up here, like in your body, like if you're feeling tight in your chest, or
like physical sensations that we have. Interoception is like, I mean, like developmentally, it's basically how kids learn that they have to go to the bathroom, or that's how they learn how to figure out whether they're hungry or they're not hungry. And so interoception is something that we kind of pay attention to over time. That's part of how kids become potty trained, because they have to take the time to notice, oh, this is what it feels like to have to go to the bathroom. And that's something that I learned just from potty training my daughter. But our interoception allows us to take stock of our internal environment.
Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we're on to the third question. In the same way that we set boundaries for ourselves and expect for them to be honored, others do the same for themselves, as we talked about. Even when we have the best intentions, sometimes it's difficult to honor the boundaries of others in the way that we would like ours honored. Can you name some of the things that may contribute to this becoming difficult to do? And what are some steps that we can take to keep ourselves in check?
I think the interesting thing about this question is, so I remember hearing, what was it? Was it a podcast? can't remember where I heard it, but I remember, I know it was Brene Brown though, but she was talking about how the best people that she knows are people that have boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I can understand that because people that have very, and let me rephrase that a little bit though, because everyone has boundaries. It's just a matter of how clear those boundaries are, how healthy those boundaries are.
Mm-hmm.
But I can understand what she says when she says that, because people that have very clear boundaries, you know, you kind of have an idea of what they're willing to engage and what they're not willing to engage, especially as you get to know someone. Like, you know, the more time you spend with your friends, you know that they like certain things or that they don't like certain things, or, you know, they don't really like being touched like that, or they want to be hugged all the time, and you have to negotiate with yourself whether that's something you want to do or whatever. Um I think that it's less important to think about the boundaries of others until they present what those boundaries are, and it's more important for us to know what we are willing to do and not willing to do, because
Mm-hmm.
boundaries are they're more personal than they are something that is like shared with other people.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that we enforce. It's something that, like, we have drawn the line in the sand or or chiseled it in stone or whatever, but it's something that's ours, that's for us, that we determine ourselves. And so if it's a matter of just disliking someone else's boundary, it's within our boundaries to be able to dislike it. And it's also up to the other person to decide how they're going to enforce their boundary when it's been overstepped.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of keeping ourselves in check with regard to other people's boundaries, um, I don't really think about that, to be honest. Like, I don't think about keeping myself in check with regard to the boundaries of others, because I focus on what my own boundaries are.
Yeah.
And it is the responsibility of the other person to uphold whatever they decide their boundaries are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I might assume certain boundaries that other people may have based upon the ones that I set for myself,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't really think about the boundaries that other people set unless they have been specific in telling me what those things are.
Yeah. Well, I think about it a lot.
I was just about to ask you, how much do you think about it?
I think about it a lot. Like, I told you the other day about how my high school sweetheart had gotten mad at me one time. And he was like, I don't want to talk to you right now. And so he hung up the phone. And so I called him over and over and over and over and over again until he turned his phone off. And then I kept trying until he turned his phone back on. Then I kept blowing his phone up. And then finally he answered the phone. And, you know, it wasn't because we probably needed to talk. It's just because I just pushed it in. But I guess in that context, I wasn't respecting his space. And I don't think that I wanted to talk to him, not because I wanted to like remedy what I had done. Like, really, like I don't think I was self-aware enough to be like, oh, I hurt your feelings. Oh, my bad. No, it was more like, oh, I don't want you to be mad at me for whatever I did. And that makes me anxious for, you know, the idea that you're mad at me. So I have to fix that because it was unsettling in me. And so that was what made it difficult for me to be able to honor his boundary. Of course, I didn't think of it like that, but you know, when I think about that, that's the first thing that comes to mind, because I blew his phone up. Blew it up. That's not the only time I've done that either, but you know, when you know better, you do better. But
yeah, that's interesting though, because I think that there is a cultural component to feeling like when someone says something, they don't mean it, or like if they say like they don't want to talk, it means that you need to pursue them more.
there's that too. Yeah, I was like, I don't care that you want to talk. Like, how can I manipulate you into like wanting to talk to me again so I'll be okay?
Yeah.
But that's where I was at, I guess, how was I, 16, 17, something like that?
Yeah, I feel like the culture of my family was very much that way, that like it was just like if you say something, it doesn't actually matter what you say, it matters what that person wants to do or what like that person is trying to achieve. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't actually matter. Like you don't get to say no, you don't get to say stop, you don't get to say I need a break, you don't get to say I can't talk to you right now, or you don't get to even negotiate what that might look like. Like, you know, with Jason and I, our boundaries are very different, especially when it comes to like disagreements. I want to talk right now, so much so that I want to talk yesterday before we disagreed. And like he needs time and space. And those boundaries are very conflicting, right? And so um we've had to come to a place where we discuss what our boundaries are, and then we discuss where we feel like we can be flexible on those boundaries. So because I want to talk right now and he wants to talk forever in the future, then the way that we've negotiated our boundaries was like, okay, let's decide on a time. Okay, can we talk in 2 hours? Oh, that's not enough for you. Oh, you want 2 days? Okay, well, that's too much for me. What about a day and 15 minutes? Like, and then we just figure out how to flex our boundaries around each other. But that's through allowing and consent.
Mm-hmm.
Like we consented to be flexible with our boundaries in those ways.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes a level of knowing yourself. Like I know that I want to talk right now. I know that it's not always fruitful or feasible to talk right now, but I do want to.
Yeah.
And he might want to avoid it like forever and like never talk about it. And that's not an option for me because I sweep nothing under the rug, so much so that I don't have a rug. So
What are those? No, I get it. Here, you already knew that. Okay, next question. What is self-resourcing and how does it fit into this discussion?
yeah, so self resourcing is, we have a lot of different resources, right? We have our communities, we have our nuclear family, we have books, we have um, whatever our spiritual traditions are, so on and so forth. But being able to self resource is fundamentally important because we need to be able to check in with ourselves, like we talked about earlier, checking in with ourselves to be able to engage anything outside of us. Um, and so self resourcing has everything to do with boundaries because until we check in with ourselves,
Mm,
we are not able to adequately set the boundaries that we need to set for ourselves.
mm. That ties it all together. So in what other contexts is it useful to practice self-resourcing?
Every context,
Every
every
con-
single one, all contexts, that context, every single one. So for me, and the thing about it is everyone has to decide when and how they do this, right?
Yeah.
For me, when I'm practicing self-resourcing, it comes up in any and every situation. If I feel a sensation in my body, I start to slow down and check in with myself to see like what is going on. If there is a disagreement that I'm having or something that I'm reading and something comes up in my mind or a memory comes up or whatever, I check in with myself. Somebody asks me if I want to have dinner and if I want to have X, Y, and Z, I stop and I check in with myself. Um, and this is really important, especially as a person that has experienced developmental trauma.
Mhm.
It was communicated to me that I didn't matter, that my thoughts didn't matter, my feelings didn't matter, my body didn't matter, nothing about me mattered. And so for a person to heal, especially when it comes to complex trauma, a person needs to be able to feel a sense of control because they never felt a sense of control. I didn't have any sense of control. And so now that I'm going through the process of recovery and so forth, it's important for me to prioritize checking in with myself and to see where I am before I engage anything else. Because it reflects back to myself, my own worth, my own value, my own importance, my own intrinsic dignity. And so I practice self-resourcing in every context.
I think you do too. We have a question in real time. Can boundaries be selfish?
No.
Why?
I mean, it depends on who you ask, because if it's a person that wants to overstep your boundary, of course your boundaries are selfish.
Yeah.
But no, like, you get to determine whatever your boundaries are. Your boundaries are yours to decide. And it really doesn't matter if someone else doesn't like your boundaries. I mean, your boundaries are determined by what is important to you, what your values are, what is important to you. That is how you determine your boundaries, and they are not selfish whatsoever.
I think that goes back to what you were talking about, how our boundaries, whatever they are learned. And so to go from, what we had in the first place to something that we decided upon, like, that's a whole thing. Like, a lot of us haven't even gotten to the place where it's like, oh, I consented to this, as opposed, I thought about this and I consented to this, as opposed to, like, this is just the way that it's supposed to be. And so I think that, like, even like when other people defining your boundaries for you, like, my body is not my own. Somebody else said that, not me. And so, but it's like, okay, well, I guess there comes a point where you have to give yourself permission to be able to make your own boundary and be okay with it. But it's like, but you also have to, like, come upon, like, the realization that, oh, like, I am allowed to give myself permission. I don't have to have somebody else permit me to permit something.
Yeah.
But that, like, that's not something that we learned, especially as Black people.
Yeah.
Church, we don't, like, we learned that we don't belong to ourselves. And wherever the authority is situated, like, that's, they have the say so. So.
Yeah. And, like, even that example that you were using about, like, you had to really think about the fact that you heard that your body wasn't your own. That's a really great place to place some mental boundaries. Like, whoever said this has a particular set of ideals that now that my awareness has increased, I don't share that, and that's a really good, clear mental boundary that you can set.
Yeah, good place to start.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see if we have any more questions. I think it was just that one. Check in with yourself as a deliberate exercise. Yes, an intentional practice. Someone said that. My mama said that. That's who said that. I think that's it. Do you have anything else you want to talk about, or that you didn't touch on?
Nope, not that I can think about. I just hope that, like, even for people that watch this later, that they take the time to take stock and really think about what their core values are and what their core beliefs are, so that way they can figure out how to develop an awareness of what their current boundaries are, and an awareness, or a constant awareness, so that way they can shift as needed, where needed, whenever it's needed, however it's needed.
Yeah. And those boundaries don't have to be what your mamas were, what your daddies were, whoever else was close to you, around you. Your boundaries don't have to look like theirs.
Yep.
Your beliefs don't have to look like theirs.
Yep.
Contrary to popular belief.
One of my spiritual boundaries of late has been I don't really share things about my faith anymore.
Talk about it.
Because after spending 2 years in seminary where it was a constant subject of conversation and dissecting it and deconstructing it and pulling it apart, after I finished school, I was like, I realized I didn't belong to myself for 2 whole years. And so that was like a very clear spiritual boundary that I had to set for myself, that like, I'm not gonna have large dialogues about my faith unless there's a moment where I feel like I want to change that. But yeah, like that's a boundary that I've been working on.
I'm trying to figure out how you were able to enforce that boundary, because people love to ask you, well, what do you think about such and such and blah 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 blah, and your people think you're rude if you don't engage. And then I don't know. And then also, just as a side note, it's just sometimes it's just not safe. Like, don't say something that might be different than what somebody else believes. It becomes not safe for your thought to exist in that space. Like, they can't exist together.
Yeah, but I think that if we can't exist in spaces as we are, then we might not need to be there. Like, it might be more violent for us to be there than not.
Where are we gonna be at, though? Back in school? I don't think so. You can't take me back.
So, like, in light of the conversation about boundaries, where do you feel like some of your work is right now?
Internally? Well, no, not internally. I would say just what we were talking about, saying, no, I'm not going to engage in this discussion about what I believe, or explaining, or I don't know, even justifying that, I can have a belief that's different.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't want to talk about that. And I guess from what you described is how I experienced school as well. It just felt like something was dying every day. Something internally was dying every day, and it was dying faster than something was resurrecting or, being born for the first time. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that that rebirth or being born for the first time, like, I don't think it's caught up with the rate at which stuff was dying.
Yeah.
I'm still in the process of trying to grieve some of the things that I lost. And yeah. So I want to be left alone while I grieve.
That is such a great way to put it. There was I feel like I'm still in that grieving process too, after graduating from school. Like, I don't, I wish someone had told me before starting, like, we have like these grand like images of going into seminary, and like, we're just like a piece of clay in the potter's hand, and it's just gonna be magnificent, and we're gonna know so much about God and theology and the Bible and the church, and we're gonna know so much that, like, we're going to see all of the nuances in between all the lines that people talked about when they preached, but we were like, how did they come to that conclusion? And we're just going to be those people, and we're going to know everything in Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic. And then you go into school and you're like, oh, look, here I am, a clay pot. And they're like, oh, wonderful. And then they take a hammer and they smash it to pieces. And then by the time you're done with school, they give you a bag of clay dust. And they're like, congratulations.
Do what you will. You want to die so bad. Form something out of dust.
And I think it puts you in such a cerebral place that it's almost like, at least for me it did, and it was so difficult to think about anything, like anything at all, without obsessing over the implications or the potential implications.
Yeah.
And after that, I was like, okay, I need to set some spiritual boundaries here. I cannot be having a bunch of theological conversations, especially when it feels more difficult to have those conversations with people that didn't take the risk of going into seminary and all that happens in that environment.
Yeah.
So then I just like, we're not going to have this conversation anymore.
No, because at that point it's like, this is not safe. I feel like my experience was similar, but it was, I don't know if it's different in this way, but I will say for myself, I came in with the like I wanted to have a safe space to be able to think, to be able to undo. But you know, I listened to a lot of Cornel West lectures, and he always talks about putting to death in you, and putting things to death that need to be you know, killed in you or whatever, whether it be like thoughts, beliefs that are harmful. But I was like, oh, cool now, but I romanticized it. And so like when it actually came down to like, oh, like this, it actually did die. I'm like, you know, and nobody knows, like there was nobody there to witness it, you know, but you, nobody really, nobody cares about it but you, because it was the only place that it was, you know, was here. I mean, yeah, it might have manifested itself externally in your actions and behaviors, but you know, I don't know. But yeah, the conversation that got heavy real quick. Back to your question about the boundaries, away from spiritual boundaries. Learning to say no in other contexts. That's another thing as well.
Yeah.
And being well with like people being able to respond in the way that they respond when you say no, and just letting them just like, you know, skedaddle, like bye.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really hard, especially because I think there are a lot of people that that may not necessarily know how to say no. And I think that this is where vocabulary is really important, learning other ways of saying no. Because if it's awkward for some people, that's an area for them to pay attention to and then work with that awkwardness. Because I think a big part of where we are culturally right now is it's like, oh, you just need to do you and so on, so forth. And like, even if you feel that no is a complete sentence and all that, like, great. But I think it's important for people to work with where they are. So maybe it is uncomfortable for some people to be like, oh, can you blah, 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 and just be like, no. Develop other ways of saying it. Like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Or
you found on what you say when you don't want to do something?
It depends.
I think you know exactly what I'm trying to get you to say.
I feel like my mind is like fishing, but
oh, you know what it is. What you say to conclude, like after you said no.
Oh yes, be blessed. Go right on, be blessed. carry your mantle and be blessed. Carry forth, go forth. But like, we need to develop our language so that way we have other ways of saying no, depending on someone's level of comfort. And
Yeah.
sometimes, what were you gonna say?
You have any examples?
Yeah, just saying like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Or I'm unavailable for that. Or no, like just thinking about who you are, how you communicate, what you want to communicate, what that relationship means to you, and how much give and take you're willing to participate in with that relationship. Because I think it's really easy to be like, no is a complete sentence when it's a stranger, but when it's someone that you really love and you care for and you spend time with and you value the relationship, you might want to say no, but you might not know how.
Yep.
Or you might be afraid of fracturing the relationship. And so developing other ways of saying no can be really helpful. It can be helpful to have other language around that. And I also, as an aside to that, I think that a lot of people carry shame for caring about what other people think. And I don't think that it's the worst thing to care about what other people think. I think it's more important to choose whose thoughts you care about.
Mm-hmm.
So that way, people won't carry shame about that, because we're communal, like we're people. We like being with other people. We love other people. We're built for community and things like that and relating with each other. And so it really isn't the worst thing to care about what people think, but whose thoughts do you care about? Yeah. So like for me, there are particular people I care about what they think. Mm-hmm. But then beyond that, I've given myself the permission to not care otherwise. But I feel like that's a good safe space for people to start with, especially people that really feel like they care very deeply about what other people think. Mm-hmm. And that can be a helpful boundary to set, like, okay, I know I care about what everyone thinks, and it's really hard for me because it's difficult for me to say no or whatever the case is. And so a great place to start would say, okay, who are 3 people that I love and respect, that I know that love and respect me, and that have in the past respected my boundaries? Maybe I can care about what they think to an extent, not more than what you think, but like, or more than how you process or what you want to engage with, but that can be a really helpful place to start.
That's very thorough, very clear.
I was trying to be very clear because I know a lot of people carry shame about that. And shame sucks. And we identify the shame with who we are. And then we feel like, oh, I'm weak because I can't say no, or I have to be avoidant because I can't engage or whatever. And it's like, let's respect that, because that might be where that person is in the moment, and then come up with ways to mitigate some of that, so that way they can figure out some steps forward that respect I think it's important to respect people's fears before you can help them move forward. And so how do you respect that fear of, because really it's a fear of disconnection, right? Like, you want to be connected with people. You don't want fissures in relationships, but we have to start somewhere, and starting with where some of that fear of disconnection lies, and then adding a sense of control to that.
That's helpful to me. 3 people, I can work with that. 3. That's the goal. Are you laughing at me?
2.
2?
Yes.
Let's start with 1. Okay.
Well, I was about to say 1 position's already taken, so you're 2 more 2 more openings.
Okay, 2. I might work myself up to so. I don't know, that's a lot too. Thank you. Okay, I think that concludes it. We're almost at the end of the hour. Checking to see if we have any more questions. Let's see. I don't see any questions. Nope. No questions, just comments. We appreciate the comments. Okay, so can you tell us about where we can find you or anything else related to your work that you would like to share?
Yeah. www.satoyafoster.com. Instagram @Satoya Foster. Twitter. I don't do Twitter. The other two things I said.
We'll put that in the comments. You said SatoyaFoster.com and then @Satoya Foster on Instagram, and you don't do Twitter.
It's too complicated.
Yes. I just started an account in July and it's
it's a struggle. I'm just like, you know what? I want to do what I can do. And it's not that.
Like, anywho. Okay, so everyone out there, if you know someone who you think needs to hear what we talked about, hit that share button. Also, don't forget to like and follow our page, Musings from the Lighthouse. And we will be back next week. Thank you, Satoya, for being here.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Okay, bye.